Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with a lecture for Anatomy and Physiology 1 on sensory and motor pathways between the brain and the spinal cord. So in this lecture, we're going to combine what you've learned about the locations of sensory information and motor information in both the brain and the spinal cord. To do this, we will trace a sensory pathway from a sensory receptor in the peripheral nervous system to the spinal cord and then ultimately to the cerebrum. We will also trace a motor pathway from the cerebral cortex to a voluntary somatic skeletal muscle. So first, let's just review the locations of white matter that you learned in the last lecture. Remember that the posterior column of white matter is carrying ascending information, so we will call that sensory information. The lateral column has both sensory and motor. So on the bottom left of the screen, there's an example of ascending information in the spinothalamic tract of the lateral column. And on the right of the picture, there is a descending tract in the lateral column, which is motor, of course, and that's called the corticospinal tract. I think maybe this picture is a little bit easier to understand than the one from your textbook. So ascending information is shown in red, and descending information is shown in green. So that is sensory is red, and motor is green. There are two different sensory tracts that we're going to use today in tracing. One is the cuneate fasciculus in the posterior column carrying touch. The other we're going to look at is in the lateral column called the spinothalamic tract, and we're going to look at pain being sent to the cerebrum. For motor, we're going to focus on the corticospinal tract, which contains neurons or descending information from the cortex to voluntary muscle. So let's start with the pathway for touch. Let's say that something has touched your skin. I'm not sure exactly what this round object is on the diagram, but nonetheless, it has touched your skin. You have felt it because you have sensory receptors in the dermis of your skin. That is connected to a sensory neuron that travels to the spinal cord. But the axon of that sensory neuron will ascend in the posterior column, in the cuneate fasciculus of the posterior column. And as it goes up, it's still in this posterior column until it reaches the level of the medulla oblongata. Now that sensory neuron is going to synapse on another neuron. And that neuron, I'm going to show in green, crosses over in the brainstem so that when it starts ascending, it's now on the other side of the body. So this skin receptor was located on one side of the body, we'll say on the right side, but now we've crossed over to the left side of the brain, up to the thalamus. So it's the second neuron has crossed over at the medulla, and it goes up to the thalamus. And remember, the thalamus is where all sensory information is organized. But another neuron now takes over the signal, and that sends the information to the cerebral cortex. And if you remember, the region of the cerebral cortex where we feel touch, somatic sensory, is in the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobe. So to do all of this, it's taken about 3 neurons, right? The first sensory neuron that went to the spinal cord and up, the second neuron that went to the thalamus, and then the third neuron that went to the cerebral cortex. Now let's look at pain and see if it's any different. Okay, so this time what touched your skin was a little painful. Okay, we're pretending, of course. It's like a pin or a tack. And again, you have sensory receptors in your skin, in the dermis, and even in the lowest level of the epidermis. If you remember, there are tactile cells there. But anyway, the sensory information is going to travel along a sensory neuron that was connected to that receptor. So this sensory neuron comes into the spinal cord, and it synapses with another neuron. And this other neuron crosses, this is for pain now, crosses in the spinal cord at that same level as where the sensory neuron was. So crossing over. Now it's going to travel upwards. Now it's going to move superiorly in the spinothalamic tract, because that's where pain travels. It'll ascend past the brainstem, and it'll get all the way to the thalamus just like before, and be organized as pain from a certain region of the body. And a new neuron will take over the signal and go again to the postcentral gyrus in the parietal lobe of the cerebrum. So to do this, again, it took 3 neurons. It's just that the crossing over happened at a different location. So if we assume again the skin is on the right side and over here is the left side of the brain, the information came into the spinal cord by a right spinal nerve through the dorsal root, but then that neuron stopped. And now there's another neuron that carries the information to the opposite side of the spinal cord, and now it ascends up to the thalamus, and the third neuron takes the information from the thalamus and sends it to the cortex. So the crossing over is what was a little bit different. We call that decussation, sometimes decussation. So for our touch example, we saw that crossing over happened at the brainstem level, but when we talk about pain, that crossing over happened at the spinal cord level. Now let's look at the pathway for voluntary motor. So you know that the primary motor cortex is in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. And so this neuron starts there with the cell body located in the gray matter of that gyrus. The axon descends through white matter that's deep in the cerebrum, we call the internal capsule. And it continues to travel down to the brainstem, and it's visible, okay, it's sort of visible on the medulla oblongata pyramids, those little bumps that we saw for the medulla oblongata. This is the same neuron, but notice that crossing over happens at the medulla. So it has crossed over, and now it travels in a white matter tract down to the appropriate level of the spinal cord. It needs to get to a level of the spinal cord that has a nerve that's going to the right location of the body. In this case, we're trying to move the arm. So that neuron travels all the way from the left side of the brain to the right side of the spinal cord, and it's traveled in a white matter tract called the corticospinal tract. Now synapsing happens with a lower motor neuron, that's what we call it, as a lower motor neuron, in the gray matter. So here in the gray matter, the ventral horn is our second neuron, and the axon comes out the ventral root through a spinal nerve, of course, and eventually to the muscle, innervates the muscle that the brain has decided we want to move. So in this case, we've only used 2 neurons. They're both motor neurons because they're carrying descending information that's ultimately going to a muscle here. The first one we call an upper motor neuron because it originates in the brain. The second one we call a lower motor neuron because it originates in the spinal cord. And you might even hear sometimes about neurological diseases that are categorized as lower motor neuron diseases or upper motor neuron diseases. Of course, anything that affects the brain, like strokes and things, you could have upper motor neuron disease. But sometimes when the spinal cord is damaged, you just have lower motor neuron disease. Okay, those are the pathways for sensory information and motor information. Thank you.